The Independent Electoral Commission will today outline whether it will be possible to register voters ahead of the local government elections. This follows an order by the Constitutional Court which dismissed an application by the IEC to postpone the elections. COGTA Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was also ordered to issue a proclamation to determine a date between October 27th, no later than November 1st. Let's unpack what all of this means. Our next guest is Head of Programs at the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. That's Grant Masterson. Grant, it's great to have you with us on the show this morning. I suppose the big question this morning is, does this automatically mean that we open up voter registration again? And if so, does it mean it gives the ANC now a chance to complete its candidate lists?
Yeah, that's the big question, and unfortunately there is not a simple answer here. The big issue with what has happened so far, the trajectory of all of these different events that have aligned to get us to where we are, is that now there is confusion even amongst people like myself who study these things and who look carefully at the law. There is now different interpretations possible as a result of a situation which is out of the ordinary. And that's, I think, the first key takeaway, which is that we are now in a situation which is very unusual. We have an attempted or a request to postpone the elections, which has been turned down by the courts. And in its order, the court has opened up the possibility for certain parts of confusion as to how the process goes from here. I'll try and unpack it, but it's confusing. We're all trying to work it out.
Really? So I mean, normally, how do candidate lists work? Is it a case of once voter registration closes, that's when the candidate lists close as well?
No, the nominations for candidates and the nominations for voter registration are two separate processes in the timetable. So the key thing to start with is that in any election, the Electoral Commission will start with a timetable. And in that timetable, voter registration is concluded some weeks ahead of the election. But of course, voter registration, which is registering voters in their wards, can continue a little bit beyond that particular date as the IEC finalizes the details of the voters' roll. So those two processes are not necessarily joint.
Right.
However, there are specific provisions in the law that indicate that in order for a candidate to be nominated, they must be registered in their ward. And so when you start to interpret these things and as lawyers apply their magnifying glasses to the various rules and laws, then you start to come up with different interpretations of this particular timetable.
Mm. What is the closing of the voters' roll? What official processes is that linked to?
So under ordinary circumstances, the voters' roll would already be closed right now because once the election date is announced and gazetted, as was the case by the Minister of COGTA, then you close the voters' roll. That happens automatically because once the election date is gazetted, the IEC closes the roll and begins to prepare it for application in the election. Now, because that roll has potentially been reopened by the order of the court, now we get into this territory that, as I say, it's not as clear, unfortunately, and this is an issue. The fact that there isn't this clarity is always a case for concern in any election. The rules should be clear and unambiguous and should be applied. Now, in this case, I don't find fault with the IEC because the application to the court has opened up this particular confusion, as well as, of course, the extraordinary circumstances that we have with certain parties failing to register all of their candidates. So the confluence of events is really what is creating a high sense of confusion at the moment, which is really not great for us.
Yeah. I mean, the COGTA Minister has been again ordered by the court to determine a date between October 27, no later than November 1st. Surely this means that the previous gazetting is no longer valid.
That's right. Well, what we do know is that the election date that was announced was annulled in that court judgment.
Right.
And so does that open the possibility for voter registration? Absolutely. What does that mean for candidate registration? That is not as clear. And that's really where the confusion lies.
So is this something that the IEC will now have to determine, given that the Constitutional Court has not given clarity around that specific issue? today when we get that briefing from the IEC at around 3 o'clock this afternoon, surely that's going to be one of the big issues that it determines. I mean, is it up to the IEC to determine something like that?
Well, under ordinary circumstances, the timetable would be very clear, and the IEC itself would not want to change that timetable. But of course, in this circumstance, we have had the IEC go to the court requesting itself for the court to give it permission to change the timetable. Now, when they announce their decision today, they have a very, very important decision to make, because no matter what decision they take, I anticipate there will be court action. If they determine that the candidate registration process will not reopen, then there is high likelihood of further legal action. And if they determine that now the election timetable can be reset and that does include the candidate nomination, then of course other parties I would anticipate will almost certainly challenge that decision. So the IEC has got to make sure that they apply their minds to what the judgment says, and that they interpret this as consistently with the law and the judgment from the Crown Court as possible, because what we don't want at this stage is further confusion created by further court judgments, as we are very, very short on time in preparing for this election, which was the reason why the IEC went to the court in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, one can just imagine a situation where court action does take place and we inch closer and closer to that November 1st deadline that was given by the Constitutional Court, and we have to go back there and ask for another extension. Yeah,
that's right. And of course, the court has indicated that there is very little, well, in fact, there's no scope for that, because the law, as they interpret it, is clear. So the elections must take place in that time.
Yeah.
And these things can be resolved. Nothing is broken as yet. But what this does do is it undermines confidence, especially amongst the voters. And that's the real shame about what has happened in the last couple of weeks, is that voters may feel as though they cannot have the same level of confidence.
Yeah.
At this stage, the process is not broken. The elections can still go ahead. All processes are being followed according to the legal prescripts. So at the moment, things are okay. But of course, this is the situation that we don't like to see, when there's so much confusion.
I mean, it would be great if ideally we didn't have politicking that also comes into play insofar as these processes are concerned. That's probably completely unavoidable. But let me ask you this. Let me ask you for your take on the issue around whether the candidate lists should be reopened for those, as you say, particular parties who didn't meet the deadline. Insofar as a free and fair election is concerned, surely that also extends to voters being able to vote for their preferred party and candidate. And however you sit, wherever you sit on the fence, the ANC is the majority party. The bulk of voters do still vote for the ANC. Will it still be free and fair if they're not able to register their candidates, if voters are not given that option of voting for their preferred candidate and party?
Well, the courts have ruled on this. They've ruled on this with both the National Freedom Party and the IFP. And in both cases,
they said it doesn't
matter.
But is that the same grant? Can you compare the NFP to a governing and majority party like the ANC? Are you comparing apples with apples there?
The whole purpose of an electoral process is to balance both of these things. So I think what we're talking about here is that in a free election, the voter has the freedom to choose the party of their choice, which should include the ANC. So on a free election, yes, the inclusion of the ANC is essential. However, the other part of it is fair, and for all parties, they must be treated fairly. And so you now have a situation where even these two competing principles of freedom and fairness are in conflict with one another here.
So what do you think the IEC should do on that score today?
Look, for me, I think that the original timetable that they had announced leading up to what was the 27th of October election will most likely be their safest option. Any attempts by the IEC or any appearance of the IEC to start to artificially manipulate the timetable beyond what they have been instructed to do by the court will most likely trigger all sorts of accusations bias and partisanship from their side. As the IEC, their reputation is very, very important right now, and it's almost one of the things that they need to manage very carefully. They need to be seen as an honest broker in these elections, so that at the end of the day, what I think are now the inevitable legal challenges that are coming their way do not cast the IEC as an actor who is actively trying to shape these elections and the results of these elections.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the situation they find themselves in, it seems very difficult that someone somewhere is not going to be able to cast that aspersion at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. An honest and unbiased broker of these elections is what the IEC is essentially wanting to come out as. Grant, thanks very much for your time this morning on what is an incredibly complicated story still, even after that decision by the Constitutional Court on Friday. Grant Masterson is head of programs. He's with the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy.